After the war, Patton didn't lose a battle. He lost permission to speak. That sounds dramatic, but look at what actually happened. He survived North Africa, Sicily, and Europe. He survived the chaos, the egos, the impossible logistics, the landmines, the weather, the enemy. He made it through a war that chewed up men like paper. And then, when the shooting stopped, he said something. One moment, one speech, one string of blunt, unfiltered words delivered with the authority of a national hero. And Washington reacted like it had just spotted a threat, not on the battlefield, in a microphone. Because in peacetime politics, the most dangerous weapon isn't a tank. It's an uncontrollable voice. Patton was never built to be quiet. He wasn't even built to be careful. He was built to win. That's the thing people forget. In war, you're rewarded for clarity. You're rewarded for conviction. You're rewarded for speaking in absolutes, for pushing people hard, for demanding speed, for treating hesitation like a disease. Patton didn't just believe that, he lived it. His entire command style was one long message: move, strike, crush, repeat. And it worked. In war, that kind of personality looks like strength. It looks like a force of nature. You can forgive almost anything when it ends in victory. The crude edges become authentic. The ego becomes confidence. The refusal to soften becomes leadership. But take the war away, and the same qualities don't become less intense. They become more visible. Without the battlefield, all you're left with is the man. And Patton was not a man who blended into the background. He spoke like a commander who expected obedience, not like a politician who needed consensus. That's where the collision starts. Because Washington in 1945 didn't need another battlefield genius. It needed stability. It needed messaging. It needed a calm transition from chaos to order. It needed the country to breathe again. It needed alliances to hold. It needed enemies clearly labeled and friends clearly reassured. It needed the victory narrative to stay clean. And Patton did not do clean. He did blunt. He did fast. He did loud. He did say it out loud when everyone else was swallowing it. In a war, that's useful. In a peace, that's dangerous. Here's the part that makes this story uncomfortable. The moment the war ended, the value of a general changed. When bullets are flying, a general is measured by results. When the bullets stop, a general is measured by risk, not what he can destroy, what he can accidentally ignite. A famous general speaking freely can cause a diplomatic crisis with a single sentence. He can give the press a headline that explodes into outrage. He can embarrass an administration. He can force officials into public damage control. He can blow up carefully negotiated relationships. He can say one thing that turns post-war rebuilding into post-war scandal. And when a hero goes off script, power doesn't debate him. Power contains him. It doesn't always do it with handcuffs. It does it with access, with assignments, with who gets to be seen, with who gets to speak, with who gets invited into the room, and who gets parked outside the room where decisions are made. That's what makes this story so relevant, because it's not a simple tale of a man punished for being rude. It's a case study in how institutions silence people without ever calling it censorship. They don't have to destroy you, they just have to make you harder to hear. So who was Patton in that moment, right after victory? He was a symbol, a walking piece of American myth, the hard-charging warrior, the man who didn't do maybe, the man who didn't speak in committee language, the man the public could point at and say, that's what winning looks like. And that symbol came with a problem. He had his own momentum. Patton didn't need Washington to be famous. He didn't need Washington to approve his tone. He didn't need Washington to translate him into softer words. He was already Patton. People already listened. The uniform didn't just represent the army, it represented authority. And authority, when it speaks without permission, becomes competition. Keep that in mind, because it explains everything that follows. In public, it's easy to tell this story like it's just personality. Patton was too much. He was outspoken. He was old school. He was not politically correct. pick your label. But under the labels is a cleaner truth. After the war, Patton's blunt honesty collided with Washington's need for control. In wartime, you can tolerate unpredictability if it creates momentum. In peacetime, unpredictability becomes a threat to the system itself, because the system is built to manage perception. And perception was everything in 1945. The world wasn't settling into peace, it was rearranging itself. Borders, governments, loyalties, ideologies, everything was in motion. The war ended on paper, but the consequences were just beginning to spread. Millions displaced, cities in ruins, economies shattered, new power balances forming. One wrong line from the wrong man could be used as propaganda, could harden positions, could turn a fragile situation into something that couldn't be walked back. And Patton had never been the kind of man who walked anything back. He didn't speak in half sentences designed to leave room for interpretation. He spoke in declarations. He spoke like a man who believed that saying something firmly could make it true. That's intoxicating when you're storming across Europe. It's terrifying when you're trying to prevent the next war. So when people ask, why was Patton a problem after victory? The answer isn't that he forgot how to lead. It's that his leadership style was built for a world where the mission was simple: defeat the enemy. After the war, the mission became complicated. Win the peace, hold the alliances, manage the public, avoid new conflicts, avoid looking weak, avoid looking cruel, avoid saying anything that could be interpreted as a threat. And Patton didn't do avoid, he did attack. Now imagine the mind of a political system watching that. You're sitting in Washington, trying to transition from wartime unity to peacetime order. You're managing allies, rebuilding Europe, watching the Soviet Union, and trying to keep Americans from turning on each other after years of sacrifice. You need the public to feel like the war ended cleanly, like the victory was moral, stable, and secure. And then there's Patton, a man who says what he thinks, a man who speaks like he's still on a battlefield, a man whose mouth moves faster than the policy memos. A man with too much prestige to ignore and too little restraint to trust. That's not just a headache, that's a risk profile. And here's where it gets weird. The danger isn't only in what he might say, it's in what he represents when he says it. Because when a random officer speaks, you can dismiss it as one man's opinion. When Patton speaks, it sounds like the army speaking. It sounds like America speaking. It sounds like policy. It sounds like intent. That's the difference between noise and signal. Patton wasn't noise. Patton was signal. And he didn't always signal what Washington wanted to transmit. So the question becomes, what do you do with a signal you can't control? You don't publicly destroy the hero. That creates backlash. That turns him into a martyr. That invites questions you don't want. That makes it look like you're afraid. Instead, you do something quieter. You reduce the platform. You control the assignment. You manage the access. You surround him with procedure. You keep him away from the spotlight. You make sure the next time he speaks, fewer people are listening. Not by banning his voice, by shrinking its reach. And that's why one moment mattered so much. Because it wasn't just controversial. It wasn't just impolitic. It wasn't a private slip-up. It was a public event with strategic consequences. It landed at the worst possible time, right when the country was trying to shift from war to order. Right when the story of victory needed to be sealed, not reopened. Right when the machinery of peacetime power was being built. And Patton didn't just say the wrong thing. He said it with the authority of a national hero. That combination is what scares power. If you like history told like a power play, where the real story is who gets to speak and who gets managed, subscribe. Because what happened to Patton after the war isn't just a biography detail, it's a blueprint. And once you see the blueprint, you can't unsee it. Because it wasn't the battlefield that ended him, it was the politics. And the first warning sign was a speech, delivered like it was nothing, that turned a war hero into a problem the system needed to solve. The war ends, and everyone expects the story to become simple. Victory, parades, homecoming, relief. But history doesn't work like that. Not when the war was global, and not when the victory leaves a vacuum. The moment Germany collapses, the battlefield disappears, and the real struggle shifts into paperwork, borders, occupations, food shortages, displaced millions, shattered governments, and fragile alliances that only held together because there was a common enemy. That's what people mean when they say post-war order. It sounds calm, it sounds clean, but it's actually the most unstable phase of the entire conflict. Because now you're not just defeating an army, you're controlling a continent, and control is political. Patton's problem is that he still thinks like a battlefield man in a world that has turned into a negotiation. He's surrounded by decisions that don't have clear targets, problems that don't have a front line, enemies that don't wear uniforms, and allies that smile while they calculate. In that environment, there are two types of leaders. The first type adapts. They soften their language. They learn to speak in careful sentences. They trade certainty for diplomacy, because diplomacy is a form of warfare where you don't get to fire a shot. You win by not creating a crisis. You win by not giving the other side a reason to harden. The second type is Patton. He doesn't see careful as wise. He sees it as weakness. He sees ambiguity as delay, and delay as loss. He expects clarity, and when he can't find it, he creates it. That's his instinct. If the situation is complicated, simplify it by force of will. In war, that instinct is legendary. In peace, it becomes combustible. Because the stakes are different now. One wrong sentence isn't just a quote. It's a diplomatic incident. It's a newspaper storm. It's a talking point for rivals. It's fuel for someone else's propaganda machine. It's pressure on the White House. It's confusion inside the military. It's embarrassment in front of allies. It's an argument on the Senate floor. It's a distraction when the country is trying to move forward. And this is the part most people underestimate. Washington isn't afraid of controversy itself. Washington is afraid of uncontrollable controversy, the kind that forces the system to react in public. Because reacting in public means admitting you were caught off guard, and institutions hate being caught off guard. So right away, the rules change. In wartime, generals speak like generals. In the transition to peace, generals start getting treated like political assets or political liabilities. Their visibility becomes a variable. Their access becomes a switch. Their words become something that needs to be pre-approved, packaged, and safe. But Patton doesn't run on safe. He runs on momentum. Now zoom in on the psychological tension. Imagine what this must feel like for him. He just helped crush Nazi Germany. He just led men through some of the hardest fighting in Europe. He watched cities burn and armies collapse. He saw what happens when weakness meets violence. He believes, with every fiber of his being, that strength is the only language ruthless regimes understand. And then the war ends, and suddenly the conversation turns into management. Management of populations, management of former enemies, management of political optics, management of what you say, how you say it, what it might imply, what it might trigger. To Patton, that feels like betrayal. Because to him, victory isn't just a result, it's a moral claim. He thinks if you defeated something evil, you're supposed to speak clearly about it. You're supposed to protect the outcome from being softened into compromise. You're supposed to finish the job, not start negotiating with consequences. So every time he hears careful language, he hears a retreat. And when he hears retreat, his instinct is to attack. That's the basic chemistry of what's happening. Patton isn't merely outspoken. He's a man whose entire internal system is tuned to a different era. An era where saying the hard thing out loud is part of the job. Washington is moving into an era where saying the hard thing out loud can start a war. And in 1945, the last thing anyone wants is another war. Not on their watch. Not after that cost. So the political objective becomes simple. Keep the transition smooth. Keep the alliances stable. Keep the public calm. Keep the narrative clean. Keep the military aligned with policy, not with individual commanders. Because a commander with his own narrative is a problem. Now let's talk about why the moment ahead, the speech, mattered so much. A controversial comment from a celebrity is annoying. A controversial comment from a general is dangerous. But a controversial comment from a victorious general in the immediate aftermath of a world war is something else entirely. That's a signal to the world. It suggests direction. It suggests intent. It suggests that the mindset of war hasn't ended, and that the people who actually control force might be thinking ahead of the politicians. That's how misunderstandings become escalation. That's how allies get nervous. That's how rivals get confident. That's how fragile stability breaks. So Washington's logic is not sentimental, it's mechanical. A famous general speaking freely is a risk multiplier, and Patton is famous and free. Now, here's the key thing. You can see the clampdown coming before it happens because the system starts tightening around him in small ways. The changes look administrative. They look like routine. They look like normal oversight, but they're a signal. This is how containment begins, not with an explosion, but with friction. Little delays, little reminders, little nudges to be careful. People around him becoming cautious. Staffers tense when he speaks. Advisors trying to soften his phrasing. Press handlers watching their watches. The air changes. Because everyone who understands politics can feel it. This man is a walking crisis if he keeps talking like it's still the battlefield. And Patton doesn't feel that tension as a warning. He feels it as an insult. He thinks, I earned the right to speak plainly. I earned the right to say what everyone else is too timid to say. I earned the right to be heard. That's the trap. In a democracy, fame feels like permission. In a bureaucracy, fame is something that must be managed. A hero is valuable only while he serves the narrative. The moment he threatens the narrative, the system turns him into a problem to be contained. And the people doing the containing don't have to be villains. That's what makes it disturbing. They can genuinely believe they're protecting the country, protecting alliances, protecting stability, protecting the public. From their perspective, this is risk management. From Patton's perspective, it's betrayal. Two perspectives, one collision. And the collision is coming to a point. Because the moment Patton steps to a microphone in this environment, the stakes are already high. It's not just what will he say, it's what will his words force the system to do next. That's the real fear. Not the speech itself, but the chain reaction it could trigger. And when you understand that, you understand why even a single line, a single comparison, a single framing, a single blunt remark could land like a grenade. Because Washington is trying to shift the country into a calm storyline. Patton is about to yank it back into conflict. Now, before we get to the moment, you need to understand something crucial about the way power works in the transition from war to peace. In wartime, the public tolerates hard men doing hard things. In peacetime, the public demands reassurance that the hard men are under control. That's the hidden contract. You can have the warrior, as long as he stays inside the story you want to tell about the war. He can be fierce, he can be aggressive, he can be ruthless, but only in the correct direction, only at the correct time, only against the correct enemy, only when the politicians can claim ownership of the outcome. When the war ends, that contract flips. Now the warrior has to become a symbol of restraint, and Patton doesn't do restraint. So the build-up to the speech isn't just a lead-in to controversy. It's a slow-motion mismatch between a man and a moment in history. He's still operating in enemy logic. He sees threats where politicians see complications. He wants to move faster than the diplomats. He wants to speak more clearly than the memos. And he's surrounded by a system that is increasingly allergic to clarity. Because clarity can be interpreted as policy, and policy can have consequences. So the stage is set, not just for a quote, but for a test. How far can a hero go before the system draws a line? And here's the thing about lines in Washington. They're rarely drawn in public. They're drawn in quiet rooms, in reassignment orders, in access decisions, in who gets invited back, in who gets placed at the center of the story, and who gets moved to the edge. The speech is about to happen, and what makes it terrifying isn't that Patton will sound angry. It's that he will sound certain. Because certainty from the wrong mouth at the wrong moment is how history changes direction. By the time Patton steps up to speak, the danger isn't invisible, it's just unspoken. Everyone around him already knows the rules have changed. They can feel it in the way questions are asked, in the way people glance at each other when his name comes up, in the way staffers try to position themselves between him and a reporter, like they're intercepting a missile. They know that in this new era, the Army doesn't just fight wars, it represents the country. And representation is a script. Patton doesn't do scripts. That's the tension humming under the room. Because when Patton talks, you're not hearing a cautious spokesperson. You're hearing a man who believes the blunt truth is a public service. A man who thinks that soft language is how nations sleepwalk into disaster. A man who sees clarity as loyalty and caution as betrayal. And to him, this moment feels normal. He thinks he's doing what he's always done. Speak directly, cut through the noise, tell people what they need to hear. He's not trying to start a scandal. That's the irony. In his mind, he's not provoking. He's correcting, he's warning, he's stabilizing the world by describing it honestly. But the system listening to him isn't measuring his intentions, it's measuring impact. And impact depends on one thing Patton can't control: what his words will do once they leave the room. Here's what makes the speech so dangerous. It isn't just a general talking. It's a victorious general talking right after the biggest war in history, during the most delicate political transition imaginable. Every sentence has gravity. Every opinion sounds like policy. Every sharp edge becomes a headline. So the moment he says something that feels even slightly outside the approved story, everyone who understands power hears the same alarm. This can't be allowed to grow. Because controversy is a fire. And fires don't stay where you put them. Patton starts the way he always does, with confidence, with command energy, with that unmistakable tone of a man used to being obeyed. It's not just what he says. It's how he says it. He speaks like he's still giving orders, like the war is still on, like there's still a clear enemy and a clear solution. And that's where the room begins to split. Some people hear him and feel a rush of relief. Finally, someone speaking plainly. Finally, someone not hiding behind diplomatic fog. Finally, someone acknowledging the dangers that careful people refuse to name. Others hear him and feel the temperature drop, because they understand how fragile the moment is. They understand that the country is trying to pivot into stability, and here is Patton, pulling the wheel hard in the opposite direction. Not with a policy paper, not with a private memo, with his voice, in public. This is where the speech becomes a problem, because it does something that scares institutions more than insults, more than controversy, more than even bad optics. It creates a political dilemma that cannot be solved with a simple correction. If Washington publicly rebukes him, it risks humiliating a war hero and triggering backlash. If it ignores him, it risks allowing his words to stand as an unofficial message. If it debates him, it gives his argument legitimacy and prolongs the cycle. So the system does what systems do when they face a threat they can't crush openly. It reaches for containment. But that decision isn't made in the room. It's made in the mental calculations happening inside the people listening. You can almost map it as it unfolds. He says something blunt. Someone in the back thinks, the press will love this. Someone else thinks, allies will panic. Someone else thinks, rivals will exploit it. Someone else thinks, the administration will have to answer for it. And someone else thinks the most important thought of all, we can't let him keep doing this. That's the moment the speech flips the room. Not when he says the sharp line, not when the audience reacts, not when the applause starts or the awkward silence forms. It flips when the people responsible for stability realize this isn't a one-off remark. This is who he is, and he's not going to stop. That's the terrifying part. Because one controversial statement can be smoothed over. You can spin it. You can issue clarifications. You can claim misinterpretation. But you can't spin a pattern. If Patton keeps speaking like this, it becomes a recurring crisis. A predictable explosion that forces the system into constant response mode. And nothing makes Washington angrier than being forced to respond. Patton's words, whether you agree with them or not, carry the weight of a man who looks like the embodiment of victory. That's why they hit differently. Not because they're necessarily more correct than anyone else's, but because they come with authority. When a famous commander frames the post-war world in blunt, combative terms, it can sound like America is preparing for the next fight. Even if that's not what the politicians want to signal. Even if that's not what the diplomats are building. Even if that's not what the public is ready to hear. And Patton is doing it anyway, because he doesn't believe the public deserves comfort. He believes the public deserves reality. That's noble in a soldier's mind. That's reckless in a politician's mind. So as the speech lands, the conflict becomes unavoidable. Patton is speaking like a commander who thinks history rewards strength, and Washington is thinking like a machine that knows history punishes instability. Patton's mistake, if you want to call it a mistake, is that he assumes victory gives him permission. But victory doesn't give you permission in peacetime power. It makes you an asset, and assets are managed. The speech is the moment Washington stops seeing Patton as a weapon it can point, and starts seeing him as a weapon that might discharge in the wrong direction. That's why the reaction is immediate, even if it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. The clampdown doesn't begin with a public confrontation. It begins with a quiet shift in how people treat him. The doors that open a little slower. The invitations that stop arriving. The calls that don't get returned as fast. The subtle decision to move him away from where his voice can travel. Because the system has learned something in real time. Patton isn't going to be edited. So he's going to be limited. And once that decision is made, everything that follows is just logistics. The backlash doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like a weather change. One minute the air feels normal, and the next minute you can tell something has shifted. Not because anyone announces it, but because everyone starts moving differently. The smiles get tighter. The conversations get shorter. The people who used to lean in now lean away. The same sentence that would have been laughed off a year earlier becomes something people repeat with a frown, as if repeating it carefully will make it less dangerous. That's how the machine reacts when a hero speaks out of turn. Not with a single dramatic act, but with a coordinated tightening. Because here's the rule. Washington rarely destroys someone publicly if it can avoid it. Public destruction creates public questions. It forces explanations. It invites reporters to dig. It risks turning the target into a martyr. It makes the system look afraid. And the system never wants to look afraid. So instead, it does something much more effective. It changes the environment around you until your voice no longer travels the same way. This is what silence looks like in a mature institution. Not a gag, a funnel. Your words still exist. They just don't go as far. And once you understand that, you start noticing the pattern everywhere, not just in this story. Because the first response to Patton isn't, "We must punish him." It's, "We must contain the consequences." That's the key difference. Patton thinks the conflict is personal, that someone is offended, that someone feels insulted, that he's being targeted because he's too blunt. But the system isn't thinking about Patton's feelings at all. It's thinking about damage control. What did he create? What will the press do with it? What will allies think? What will rivals exploit? What will Congress ask? What will voters feel? What will the administration have to deny tomorrow morning? That's the chain reaction Washington fears, a hero's sentence turning into a national distraction. And Patton's sentence has the perfect ingredients to become exactly that: moral heat, political risk, and a familiar name. So the backlash escalates through layers. First, there's the media layer. Headlines, framing, selective quotes. the kind of simplified narrative that turns nuance into a weapon. A complicated post-war reality gets squeezed into one question. Why is this famous general saying this now? Then there's the diplomatic layer, the messages behind the scenes, the worried readings, the anxious interpretations. Because when a national figure speaks, foreign governments don't ask, was he joking? They ask, is he signaling something? Then there's the internal layer, the military as an institution. Because the army is not a free-floating collection of personalities. It's a hierarchy. It can't afford a famous commander making it look divided or unpredictable, especially not when the country is trying to reassert order. And then there's the political layer, the White House and the broader machinery of government, looking at the situation and seeing not a speech, but a problem that needs to be neutralized. Not argued with, neutralized. Now, watch what they do next, because it's the most important part of the entire story. They don't say, we're silencing him. They never say that. They do it the way institutions do everything, through normal-looking procedures. It's the perfect camouflage. If you're angry, you look emotional. If you're procedural, you look reasonable. If you punish openly, you look vindictive. If you reassign, you look responsible. So the first move is to shrink his platform. Not officially, quietly. You control who gets access to him. You control which interviews are allowed. You control which events he speaks at. You make sure he's surrounded by handlers who are trained to minimize risk. You filter the questions. You steer the locations. You steer the audience. And you don't call it censorship. You call it communications. That's how modern power works. It doesn't forbid speech. It manages exposure. Then comes the second move. You control the story about him. If you can't control his mouth, you control his label. You don't need to prove he's wrong. You just need to frame him as a problem. Not a genius. Not a hero. A problem. Unpredictable. Undisciplined. A liability. A man who doesn't understand the moment. A man who can't adjust. A man stuck in a war mindset. Because once that frame sticks, every future sentence he says arrives pre-damaged. Even when he's right, people hear, there he goes again. Even when he's warning, people hear, he's stirring trouble. Even when he's honest, people hear, he's reckless. And framing is half of silencing. If you can make the audience distrust the messenger, you don't have to touch the message. Then comes the third move. You redirect him. This is where it gets especially clean, because redirecting a general looks like normal military bureaucracy. Rotations, appointments, assignments, promotions, reviews, paperwork, planning. But an assignment is also a platform. If you assign a famous man to a place where cameras don't follow, you haven't punished him, you've relocated his influence. If you give him a role where he can't shape policy, you haven't destroyed him, you've redirected his energy into a box. And the public might not even notice, because the public doesn't live inside the machinery. The public sees a uniform and assumes power. But power is access, and access is controlled. So the system starts doing what it always does to uncontrollable assets. It limits access. And once access is limited, the rest is just time. Because the more you limit access, the more the public forgets. It's not a dramatic fall, it's a slow fade. That's the cruel genius of it. The hero doesn't get a clean enemy to fight. There's no single villain, no battlefield, no obvious front line. Just decisions that quietly reduce his reach until he's shouting into a smaller and smaller room. And Patton can feel it. He can feel it in the way people avoid committing to him, the way conversations end faster, the way opportunities dry up. The way his name becomes something people say cautiously, like it's a match near gasoline. But here's the trap. The more he senses the clampdown, the more he wants to push back with his voice. And the more he pushes back, the more the clampdown feels justified to the people managing him. It becomes a loop. He speaks, they tighten. They tighten, he speaks harder. And every time that happens, The system becomes more convinced it's dealing with a weapon that can't be safely carried. This is the moment where you can see two entirely different philosophies colliding. Patton's philosophy is simple: truth is strength, and strength prevents disaster. Washington's philosophy is also simple: stability is strength, and stability prevents disaster. They both think they're protecting the country. They just disagree on what the danger is. Patton thinks the danger is external threats and weakness. Washington thinks the danger is internal chaos and uncontrolled messaging. And Washington has one advantage. It controls the infrastructure of attention. It controls the microphone. Now let's get specific about what silencing without saying the word actually looks like, because it's not one thing. It's a toolkit. First, platform reduction. This isn't dramatic, it's administrative. It's when the invitations slow down, the press access becomes restricted, the interviews become not advised, the schedule becomes tight, the photo ops go to someone else, the speeches get fewer, the audiences get smaller. It's subtle enough that you can always deny it. If someone asks, you can shrug and say, scheduling. But it works. Because your influence doesn't vanish, it just gets compressed. Second, assignment control. A commander's assignment is not just a job, it's a stage. Put him on a stage where the spotlight doesn't shine and you've changed his relationship with the public. Put him in a role where he can't shape the conversation and you've reduced the risk. Again, you don't call it punishment, you call it needs of the service. Third, isolation. This is the one people overlook because isolation doesn't look like a policy. It looks like social gravity. The people who used to be close suddenly create distance. The allies inside the institution stop attaching themselves to you because attaching themselves to you starts to feel costly. And institutional loyalty is often less about friendship and more about survival. So he gets fewer defenders, fewer informal advocates, fewer people willing to take a risk on him, fewer people willing to say, let him speak. Isolation is silence in human form. Fourth, reputation framing. Once the story becomes Patton is a liability, every meeting involving Patton begins with a defensive posture. Not what is he saying, but how do we prevent what he says from becoming a problem? That is the point where a man's identity becomes a containment problem. And once that happens, he's functionally already been silenced, because now everything he does is filtered through risk. Fifth, procedural pressure. Committees, reviews, inquiries, assessments, constant oversight. Not necessarily to destroy him, but to slow him down, exhaust him, and surround him with friction. You can't speak freely if every sentence becomes something that triggers a new round of administrative reaction. And if you try to fight procedure, you look guilty. If you comply with procedure, you lose momentum. Either way, you slow down. And slowing down is a form of control. Now notice what's missing from that toolkit. There's no public trial. There's no formal censorship. There's no announcement that the hero is banned from speaking. Because the system doesn't need to make it obvious. It just needs to make it effective. And if you're watching carefully, you can see the strategy. Don't create a martyr, create a fade-out. That way, the public doesn't rally around. The public just moves on. And that's the point where Patton's situation becomes almost tragic. Because he can handle enemies, he can handle bullets, he can handle chaos. What he can't handle is being managed. The battlefield makes sense to him. You push, the enemy pushes, someone wins. Politics doesn't feel like conflict to him. It feels like paralysis, like cowardice, like people hiding behind language to avoid responsibility. So he reacts the way he always reacts. He doubles down on clarity. And clarity is exactly what Washington is trying to prevent from becoming a headline. Now, if you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, not just what happened, but how the machine works, subscribe. Because the pattern isn't unique to Patton. It's a repeatable technique. And once you learn it here, you'll recognize it everywhere. Here's another uncomfortable truth. The system doesn't need Patton to be wrong to justify this. It only needs him to be uncontrollable. That's why this isn't about truth versus lies. It's about control versus unpredictability. Because unpredictability is expensive. It forces the system to spend attention, to spend political capital, to spend credibility, to spend time. And time, after a war, is the one resource you can't afford to waste. So the backlash doesn't conclude with a public humiliation. It concludes with something far more precise, a quiet decision that Patton's microphone must be removed, not because he can't speak, but because he can't be edited. And the moment that decision is made, the rest becomes simple. Contain him, isolate him, reduce his reach, make sure the next time he speaks, fewer people are listening, and make sure that when the public remembers him, they remember a brilliant commander with an asterisk, a hero with a warning label, because that warning label isn't just about him. It's a message to every future commander who might confuse battlefield authority with political permission. In wartime, you can be legendary and unfiltered. In peacetime, being unfiltered is exactly what gets you filtered out. From Patton's perspective, what's happening feels like a betrayal dressed up as professionalism. He did what the country asked. He took the fight to the enemy. He pushed harder, moved faster, demanded more, and produced results that became legend. In his mind, that should buy him something priceless, the right to speak plainly about what comes next. And now, he's being treated like a risk, not celebrated, managed, not trusted, handled. That shift is infuriating to someone like Patton, because it violates the logic he believes in. Performance earns authority, victory earns credibility, sacrifice earns respect. But Washington doesn't run on the moral logic of the battlefield. It runs on the logic of the state. And the state cares less about whether you earned your voice than whether your voice can destabilize the machine. So if you want to understand why it had to be done, you have to step into Washington's mindset for a moment. And it's not a mindset that feels noble. It feels cold. But it's coherent. In the aftermath of a world war, the single overriding objective is to prevent another one. That means stabilizing alliances, rebuilding economies, managing occupied territories, and shaping narratives that keep the public calm and foreign governments predictable. Predictable is everything, because unpredictability creates fear, and fear creates escalation, and escalation creates conflict. Now place a famous general into that equation. A famous general is not just a public figure. He's a symbol of force. He is the face of the country's ability to destroy. When he speaks, he doesn't sound like a columnist. He sounds like the end of a sentence. So if that symbol speaks freely, if he talks like the war never ended, it sends signals the government may not want to send. Even worse, it can send signals the government doesn't even agree with. And this is where Washington's fear becomes very rational. If Patton is allowed to keep speaking without restraint, then America starts to look divided. The administration says one thing, the hero says another, and foreign governments don't know which voice represents intent. And in international politics, confusion is dangerous. Confusion can look like weakness. Confusion can look like internal conflict. Confusion can invite pressure from rivals and panic from allies. So Washington's view is, we don't have the luxury of letting a national hero freelance. Not because we hate him, because we can't afford him. This is the key. What Patton sees as honesty, Washington sees as an uncontrolled transmission. In war, uncontrolled transmissions are how you get people killed. So the instinct to clamp down is not purely political, it's also institutional. The military is built on unity of command. The state is built on unity of messaging. Both collapse when famous figures create competing narratives. That's why, from Washington's perspective, the question isn't, is Patton right? The question is, can Patton be controlled? And once the answer becomes no, the outcome becomes inevitable. Because institutions do not negotiate with uncontrollable variables, they isolate them. Now, here's the hard part. Patton cannot adapt to this environment because adapting would require him to do something that feels like self-betrayal. He would have to soften his language. He would have to speak in maybe. He would have to let diplomats lead the story. He would have to accept that in peacetime, the winners don't always get to define what winning means. That is poison to his personality. Patton's identity is built around conviction, around action, around speed, around the belief that clarity is a moral duty. So when the system asks for restraint, he doesn't interpret it as wisdom. He interprets it as cowardice. And when he sees cowardice, he wants to smash it. Not with fists, but with words sharp enough to cut through it. That's why his conflict with the system becomes self-reinforcing. The more the system tightens, the more he resists. The more he resists, the more the system tightens. And because the system controls the infrastructure, access, platforms, assignments, the system has the advantage. Patton can win battles, but he can't win a fight where the enemy is procedure. You can't charge procedure with a tank. You can't outflank a memo. You can't overwhelm bureaucracy with bravery. And that's what makes this such a brutal kind of defeat. It's a battlefield where his strengths don't apply. In a conventional fight, Patton could see the front line. In this fight, the front line is invisible. It's the moment someone decides not to put him on a program. It's the moment someone decides to review his request. It's the moment someone decides to send someone else to the podium. It's the moment someone decides the story should move on without him. And because none of these moments are dramatic, the public doesn't treat them as an execution. But they are. They are the execution of influence. The system isn't taking his rank, it's taking his reach, and reach is power. Now imagine how Patton experiences this psychologically. He is surrounded by the dull machinery of peacetime authority, and every part of it feels like people hiding from reality. He's watching men in suits decide the story of victory, and he feels like they're sanding down the truth into something soft enough to sell. To Patton, that's not leadership, that's theater. And the worst part is that the theater works. Because most people want the soft story. Most people want closure. Most people want peace to feel simple. Most people don't want to hear a war hero say something that sounds like another conflict is inevitable. So when the machine starts positioning Patton as a problem, it finds a receptive audience. Not everyone, but enough. Enough for the frame to stick. This is what institutions do brilliantly. They take a complicated conflict and simplify it into a personality issue. They make it about temperament instead of power. They make it about discipline instead of fear. They make it about professionalism instead of control. And once the public accepts that frame, the moral stakes vanish. It stops being a question of whether the system is silencing a voice and becomes a question of whether the man brought it on himself. That's how you neutralize a hero without looking like a villain. Now, here's the line that defines the whole situation. Patton believed his job was to tell the truth as he saw it. Washington believed Patton's job was to align with policy. Those are two different definitions of duty. And the moment the war ends, Washington's definition wins. Because in peacetime, the highest priority is not battlefield truth, it is political stability. That's why the clampdown had to be done from their perspective. Not because they wanted to humiliate him, but because they feared what might happen if he kept speaking without restraint. Feared what it would do to alliances. Feared what it would do to negotiations. Feared what it would do to domestic unity. Feared what it would do to the myth of clean victory. And above all, feared what it would do to the most important thing any administration wants to project after a war: control. Because control signals safety. Control signals competence. Control signals that the chaos is over. An uncontrollable hero signals the opposite. So the system makes its choice. Not loud, not cruel, just decisive. It treats Patton like a weapon that cannot be safely carried in peacetime, and it puts that weapon back in the case. Patton doesn't understand that logic because he is still operating under wartime rules. Strong men speak strongly, and the world becomes safer when you tell the truth. But the world of peacetime power is different. Strong men are dangerous when they speak outside the script. And when a strong man is dangerous, the system doesn't need to destroy him. It only needs to remove the microphone. Once the decision is made, The rest doesn't feel like drama, it feels like administration. That's how you know the containment is real. It doesn't arrive with a press conference. It arrives with a calendar change, a new assignment, a different chain of meetings, a shift in priorities that looks boring on paper and devastating in effect. Because when you silence someone this way, you don't have to attack them. You just have to place them where their voice can't travel. And from the outside, it looks almost respectful. He still has a title. He still has a uniform. He still has rank. He still has the outward symbols of importance. But the center of gravity has moved away from him. It's the quiet demotion, not necessarily in formal status, but in relevance, in access, in influence, in attention. And attention is the real currency here. The public tends to think power is office or rank or authority on paper. But in a modern state, power is also placement inside the information flow. Who gets quoted? Who gets invited? Who gets amplified? Who gets positioned as a voice of the future? And who gets framed as a voice of the past? Patton is framed as the past, not because his victories were forgotten, but because his presence becomes inconvenient to the new story. The country needs to believe the war ended and the adults are in charge. The country needs to believe the future will be managed calmly. The country needs a narrative of stability. Patton's voice, whether you agree with him or not, is a voice that disrupts stability. So stability wins. And what happens next is exactly what happens to anyone the system decides to fade out. Fewer cameras, fewer invitations, fewer headlines that cast them as central. The same press that once chased him now turns toward the next figure. The same political class that once praised him now speaks of discipline and professionalism. The same institution that once rewarded his aggression now promotes the kind of leader who can sit in meetings and never create a headline. The system doesn't have to say, Patton is silenced. It just has to make him less present. And eventually, the public assumes the silence is natural. That's the genius of it. If you do it slowly enough, it looks like time. Now think about what this does to Patton as a man. He is not the kind of person who can thrive on the sidelines. He's built for forward motion, for friction, for decisive action. Put that kind of person into a world of managed messaging and careful silence, and you're not just limiting his influence. You're stripping his identity, because in his mind, the war didn't just end, it paused. And the pause feels wrong. It feels like the world is pretending the danger is gone when it isn't. It feels like people are trading truth for comfort. It feels like people are using victory as a lullaby instead of a warning. So his frustration doesn't evaporate, it intensifies. But the more he intensifies, the more the system feels validated in keeping him away from the microphone. And that's the final trap of containment. It provokes the very behavior that justifies it. Now, if you zoom out, you can see the bigger institutional lesson being written in real time. Patton isn't just one general, he's a test case. He's a message sent through the military about where authority really lives after a war. In wartime, a commander with results can become a kind of celebrity. He can gain momentum, he can gain political weight, he can gain the ability to shape public opinion. But after the war, the state reasserts something fundamental. No matter how legendary you are, your voice is not above the script. Not because the state hates heroes, because the state cannot allow independent centers of influence inside a hierarchy built on unity. That's the part people don't like to admit, because it sounds cynical, but it's real. Institutions don't just manage enemies, they manage allies, they manage symbols, they manage heroes. And when a hero threatens the system's control of the narrative, the system will choose narrative control every time. Because narrative control is how you prevent panic, how you maintain alliances, how you keep negotiations from collapsing, how you stop opponents from exploiting confusion. It's how you keep the machine stable. So the containment of Patton is not just a story about one man being too blunt. It's a story about how peacetime power operates. In war, the state tolerates rough personalities because the mission is survival. In peace, the state demands alignment because the mission is legitimacy. and legitimacy requires calm. Now, let's land the core chain one last time, cleanly, because it's the spine of the entire story. Patton speaks in a way that carries authority. Those words create political risk at a fragile moment. Washington recognizes the risk isn't temporary, it's a pattern. Washington doesn't destroy him publicly because public destruction is expensive. Instead, Washington reduces his platform, controls his access, and reframes his reputation. Patton remains a hero on paper, but his reach is quietly cut down. The battlefield didn't end him, politics did. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Patton. Because once you see how the system did it to him, you can recognize the template. You can recognize it in every era, in every institution, in every moment where a powerful person discovers that success doesn't automatically grant permission. Permission is control. That's the part people miss. We grow up believing that achievements create freedom, that if you win enough, you can speak openly, that if you're valuable enough, the system has to tolerate you. But systems tolerate value only when it's predictable. Unpredictable value is a liability. Unpredictable heroes are liabilities. That's why the verdict isn't Patton was weak. Patton wasn't silenced because he was weak. He was silenced because he was uncontrollable. And uncontrollable is the one thing peacetime power cannot afford. Because peacetime power doesn't need the loudest voice, it needs the safest voice. It needs the voice that won't create a crisis at 8 a.m. and force the entire government to spend the day explaining it. It needs the voice that stays inside the story. Patton didn't stay inside the story, so they didn't defeat him in battle. They removed his microphone. That's the difference between wartime glory and peacetime power. And if you want more stories like this, where history is explained as a fight over narratives, platforms, and control, subscribe. Because once you understand how power silences without saying the word, you'll start spotting the pattern in places you never expected.